Hello. Yeah, I'm trying something different because I'm in a. It's Valentine's Day in Dallas, and as you can see behind me, it's snowing. The Arctic breach has resulted in some unseasonable weather here in Dallas. Been here for a couple of years. Never seen it snow like this. I remember one day a long time ago, I made a phone call. Why? Because I was working and I heard that somewhere in another part of the world, I didn't usually get snow, had just received snow. It was snowing. And I'm like, whoa. And I remember talking to this guy from that part of the world, and he said he loved snow, but he didn't have much of an opportunity to see it. So I rushed home and I had a phone card, an international phone card. I called the guy up and I tried the number I had and it didn't. He wasn't answering. So I was like, oh well, I got this cell phone number. Let me call the cell phone number. I called the cell phone number and I'm like, hey, it's snowing. And he's like, yeah. And then we started having this conversation and he was walking at that time outside in the snow. And he was talking about the snow and all these things. And he told me where he was going. I'm like, wow, I didn't know that's what you did. And he's like, yeah. Then I hung up the phone. I'm like, oh shit. That was the other guy I met who had the same name. It's a true story. Because I met two guys that had the same first name. And one of them gave me his home number, and the other guy gave me his mobile number. So on the day that it was snowing, I ended up calling the other guy. It was the first time I called him. We ended up having quite a relationship since then. And that's why I'm thinking right now about what it means that it's snowing in Dallas like this and all this other stuff has happened. And I'm going to do something. It's absolutely 100% spiteful. I'm going to sit out here in the snow on the little patio of this place. And I'm going to read from this book I got. It's one of these, it's called Deliberate Deceptions, Facing the Facts About the U.S.-Israeli Relationship. This guy, he wrote it. This guy, I mean, he took an interest in it. He was in Congress and he was on the Foreign Affairs Committee for a while. You know, he says something very interesting in here. He says that while he was actually in service as a member of Congress, that he did not vote against any bill or any effort or any package that was proposed to support what Israel was doing. Even though there were all of these contestations about their human rights violations, even though there was all this understanding that what they were doing was completely out of line with the sorts of standards that other countries were being held to. That up until 1983, when he was in Congress, he never voted against any military aid package. But after he got out, he was trying to do some exposure and he learned about some things. And this is the second book he wrote. And I read through the first book when I did this talk in Chicago. The actual topic was about the distinct relationship the United States had around free trade with Israel that was unique with any other country. One of the specific things that I remember was very important was that when the United States developed its free trade agreement with Israel, that there was a specific aspect concerning technology, especially technology connected to software, and that in any sort of joint technology development between the United States and Israel, Israel was entitled to maintain patent rights on anything it developed as part of these partnerships. So Israel and Israeli companies were allowed to have their own distinct situation when it came to patents and copyrights on anything that was developed, unique from any other relationship the United States ended up having with any country around technology sharing. Now, I've read through a lot of the old treaties, pretty much most of the ones that are active still, regarding the United States and Israel, and the formal treaties in force and the cross-referencing with the history of treaties when I had access to a library of that sort. You know, with COVID now, it's very hard to get access to those kind of resources because even if the library is open, you can't get in to check out the reference session. You can't get into a library to go to the reference section and do the research yourself. You can't check out a reference book, and they won't let you on site. Only certain people are allowed to actually access the libraries anymore. And if you want to check a book out, well, there's a whole process they go through where they code your book checkout to any a number of other things. that have nothing necessarily to do with you and might actually be completely contrary to what you would have done with that information. So there's absolutely this very serious constraint that's been placed around access to information that not only was previously accessible to the public, but was a condition of justification for the kind of financing these institutions expect to be able to draw on based on the collateral of the people. When you got a library that purports to have an inventory or a catalog of the kind of offerings a library does, when it applies for or tries to substantiate a justification for taking out bonds, including bonds worth, in some cases, more than $100 million, it's based on the fact that it is providing a service to the public. And hence, because the public's using it, then we should invest in it. There's nothing wrong with that if it's legitimate. But if you call for an investment in a public facility and go through the process of saying that you're entitled to obligate the public to a certain level of public service debt to justify supporting that facility, this is not just about workers' rights. This is also about the fact you can't justify the financing for that facility and what you're doing in that facility if you can't deliver on what you said you were going to do with that financing, including providing people in the public you're drawing on as part of that financing, providing us with what you said we were going to be provided with when we were signed up for the bond obligation. This is what's going on in a lot of ways. It's part of the reason that I've been following these different bond issues, even before the COVID-19, but I've been especially diligent in trying to identify how these things are being changed with the situation going on with COVID-19. There's a lot of obligation that was set up before COVID-19. They're trying to reconfigure and refactor, and we're still supposed to be obligated to it, sometimes for 20, 30 years, right? 30 years of being obligated to something. It was signed up on intentionally what terms? What terms was the original obligation incurred? And did they expect you to be participating in financing it for 30 years? Even when they signed up knowing at the onset of the signing up that they were asking for 30 years at one rate they did not intend to maintain for how long? A year? 5 years? 10 years? Do you have to maintain the same level of consistency for all 30 years in order to be justified, saying you're qualified to obligate people to service for all 30 years? What about if you have a 100-year bond? What if you take out a war bond or a bond on reconstruction following a war? What did you bond? These people that took out war bonds, liberty bonds in the First World War, what were they taking these bonds out for? Were they taking these bonds out for a new batch of chemical and biological weapons? I contend they didn't. I contend that the people who took out bonds on the issuance of liberty bonds did it with an understanding that they were hoping to get partners in reconstruction post-war of what had been destroyed. And that also included repatriation or restitution for what was taken from them that substantiated the war to begin with. So that's why, even though it's been 15 years, actually, since I've been able to have a conversation with anybody that'll talk to me honestly and authentically about the kinds of stuff that was written in this book, I'm actually very grateful to have it, and I'm going to be completely 100% spiteful today, and I'm going to read it outside, right here in this beautiful, freshly fallen snow. Page 3, 1, Israel's claim to Palestine. Israel bases its claims to establishment of a state in Palestine on three major sources: the legacy of the Old Testament of the Bible, the Balfour Declaration issued by Great Britain in 1917, and the partition of Palestine into Arab and Jewish states recommended by the UN General Assembly in 1947. Fallacy. Quote, by virtue of our natural and historic right, we do hereby proclaim the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel, the state of Israel, end quote. Israel's Declaration of Independence, 1948. Fact. Historically, Jews were not the first inhabitants of Palestine, nor did they rule there for as long as a number of other peoples did. Modern archaeologists now generally agree that Egyptians and Canaanites inhabited Palestine from the earliest recorded days of around 3000 BC to around 1700 BC. There followed other occupiers such as Hyksos, Hittites, and Philistines. The Hebrew period of rule started only in 1020 BC and lasted until 587 BC. The Israelites were then overrun by Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, Egyptians, and Syrians until the Hebrew Maccabees regained partial rule in 164 BC. However, in 63 BC, the Roman Empire conquered Jerusalem, and in 70 AD destroyed the Second Temple and scattered the Jews into other lands. In some, ancient Jews controlled Palestine or some major parts of it for less than 600 years in the 5,000-year period of Palestine's recorded history. Less than Canaanites, Egyptians, Muslims, or Romans. The U.S. King Crane Commission concluded in 1919 that a claim based on an occupation of 2,000 years ago can hardly be seriously considered. Oh no. On May 14, 1948, a total of 37 men attended the Tel Aviv meeting at which Israel's independence was declared as a natural and historic right. But critics charged that their action had no binding legal force in international law because they did not represent the majority population at the time. In fact, only one of them had been born in Palestine. 35 were from European countries and one was from Yemen. Asserts Palestinian scholar Issa Nakhle, the Jewish minority had no right to declare an independent state on a territory belonging to the Palestinian Arab nation. Well, this is the first fact that former Congressman Paul Findley attempts to debunk. Personally, I think debunking is a massively under-acknowledged skill, pastime, and virtue. I think that debunking is very important. It's about how you debunk that matters. Starting things based on this kind of historical claim, I mean, that's where he decided to start. I'm outside right now. This place is called Dallas. The first thing I learned about the history of Dallas is that at a specific period in time, there was an economic depression. It was around the beginning of the war, and it was decided by a group of business people in Dallas, a couple of guys, including some bankers, that they were going to put on an exhibition. They were going to do something comparable to a World's Fair or exhibition as a way to galvanize people's attention and to stimulate the economy. As a matter of fact, downtown, there's an area that is filled with auditoriums. It's where the Botanical Gardens is. There's a women's center. It's a sort of area. It has a very compelling aesthetic. It's not something you see very much in this part of Texas, but I understand there are other parts of Texas that hearken more to that style of architecture and kind of manner of the facade, the materials they use. It's still a vestige of that time period. Those people, that group, they have their office in the Bank of America Tower downtown. There's a Bank of America Tower right downtown, less than 2 blocks away from the federal courthouse. I wish that my introduction to Dallas had been different. You know, those guys, they were not in a majority at the time, but they had a very profound impact. Very profound. It's interesting over time who they acknowledge and who they don't. It's before 5 o'clock on Valentine's Day. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.